In January, I facilitated a project called the Stranger Stranger Supper Series, and this was a series of meals, performative meals along University Avenue at different restaurants, local restaurants. It was supported through the Irrigate Arts Initiative. So the idea was to build community and foster business during the construction period of the light rail construction. And so what these meals were, it's kind of complicated to explain, but basically members of the public were invited to submit their interest to play a main character, and that meant that they received a character profile that I created for them, and then 6 people came together as those characters and had dinner together. So 6 strangers coming together for dinner at a local restaurant, and anybody else was welcome to come and interact with the performance. If they wanted, they could create their own characters, they could interact as themselves, or they could just be a fly on the wall and eavesdrop and watch it unfold. And so it was sort of an experiment in what happens when you have only characters and no plot, because the plot just emerged from whatever the characters decided to do. And it also brought people to the restaurants who had never been there before. So it was a mix of performative experiment and food experimentation.
So how did the Stranger Stranger project go?
It was great and bizarre. I really had no expectations. I did not know what was going to happen, and of course there were moments where I started imagining the worst of the things that could happen when you bring strangers together in a space, in a performative setting. You never know how people are going to get carried away. But people seemed to really come together in the spirit of the project, which was supporting these businesses and building community and just doing something fun together with other strangers in public. So I think all of the meals went... people stayed in character all the way through each of the meals. No one decided they were over it and stopped. People went really all out with their characters. There were some really excellent costumes. One of the characters was an entomologist, and she did all kinds of research to figure out what kind of entomologist she was. She had earrings that I believe were dragonflies, and she was very invested. We had some, one of the first meal was largely kind of insular. It was kind of difficult to hear the conversations that they were having. So people at other tables started finding ways to interact and to try and spur the characters to be more performative. So they were sending notes to the table through waiters, and actually the waiters and the restaurant owner began getting involved. This was at Non-Vietnamese Bistro. They started inserting storylines and trying to get a rise out of the characters. So there were some performative moments there, but a lot of scheming too, just around the table. The second meal was at Homey Mexican restaurant, and that was a much more intimate environment, and the main characters were right in the center of the restaurant. So it was much easier to hear their conversation, and it was a much more serious conversation overall. They got right into a discussion about kids, having children. They talked about climate change. There was a skeptic at the table, and so there were lots of people fighting for climate change. I mean, it wasn't like a heated argument, but it did get a bit tense. And so that meal had its own flavor, if you will. And then the third meal was the most social of all. It was that little Szechuan Chinese restaurant, and the main table made friends with a group at the next table over who had come for the performance, and they ended up pushing their tables together, and so there was a huge table of maybe 12 to 15 people who ended up sharing that meal together. So each one was kind of wildly different, but fun in its own way. And I actually ended up having a potluck dinner here at my house, where all the strangers could come as themselves and meet each other in their real characters, their own characters. And that was really, really excellent, the stories that people told about their experiences. One woman told us that this was actually not at the potluck because she wasn't able to come, but she had written to me and said that she had gotten into a car accident a few days before the event, and at the supper she told the story of getting in the car accident, but she told it as her character, and she said it was actually a really excellent way to process what had been a pretty traumatic experience. She had been flipped across the freeway, and came out okay, miraculously, but it was interesting. She found it easier to talk about and process with a group of strangers in a character very different from her own life, but telling this true story. So things like that came out of it that were far beyond my own expectations of what might happen.
I mean, one part of this is dispensing with the stage.
Yes.
And also dispensing with the convention that everybody who is at the play knows that they're at a play. What's that like? Just, it's not clear where the performance ends. Mm-hmm. And it's not clear that everyone who is an audience member, from the standpoint of seeing the play, is an audience member in the sense of having a proper audience member attitude.
Right.
So what's that all about?
Yeah.
Is this new? Is this a part of a long tradition of avant-garde theater of which I know nothing? How does this go?
Well, there is a long tradition of doing performance outside conventional spaces, and certainly doing it in public spaces in sort of an invisible way, or maybe visible, maybe not visible. But people are constantly experimenting with what those boundaries are, and I'm particularly interested in the performance of everyday life and how we perform ourselves in different settings, and to what extent those personas are our real selves. Are they all our real selves? Do we embellish ourselves? What are those lines? So there's something really interesting to me about embracing a totally fictional character, but inevitably bringing yourself into it, which is something all actors do on stage too. But putting it in a public setting, the lines become even blurrier, because there are questions about who's acting and who's not. There are questions about how much fiction even the main characters have embraced. I gave them these character profiles all as prompts, and I said, take it or leave it. This is the character, this is who you are, this is where you're coming from, this is what brought you to dinner, this is your background, your family, your education, your work, things like that. But I told them, you can disregard any of that if you'd like to make up your own story or just use yourself. It's up to you. And different people embrace different levels of fiction. So I find that interesting. And I find the very real conversations that happen in that setting very interesting. Most of the participants did not have an acting background, actually. And there were 40 submissions for 18 spots. So there was clearly this interest in participating in this kind of setting, and I think a lot of the interest came from people who would never set foot on a stage, but were intrigued by the prospect of seeing what this could be like in maybe a more on more level ground, maybe in this public space where anyone might or might not be acting and no one necessarily knows. So it's kind of a place where you can be a little mysterious and try things that you wouldn't normally try. I had one person who came to see the suppers who was not acting. She wasn't interacting, really. She mostly was just watching. She said that over the course of the evening, she felt like all the rules for social interaction had changed. Like, suddenly by the end of the meal, she was joking with her waiter in a different way, and she was observing people in a different way, and had a sense that she could do anything. She could go up to anyone and say anything, and it would be part of the excitement. But she wasn't acting, so it was just the being surrounded by that was changing her perspective on the social norms. And I think that raises interesting questions about what are these social norms and what rules are we deciding to go by, what rules do we feel like we have to go by, and what does it take for us to feel like those rules don't matter anymore. It's more intimidating in some ways to have this added layer of acting or being someone else. But in some ways, I think for many of the participants, it was also very liberating, because in some ways you can sort of hide behind this persona and you have things to latch onto, so you don't have to be as vulnerable talking about yourself or being, playing yourself. And in some ways, I think that eventually made people more comfortable talking as themselves, because they could kind of choose how personal they wanted to make it. So that was an interesting thing. And then I also, people, when they submitted their interest to participate, I asked them to just tell me some things about themselves, and they had the choice of what to tell me. But based on what they told me, I tailored the characters a little bit. So, we had a university professor who was playing someone who manages a grocery store. And, people in some cases in quite different occupations or economic statuses or life backgrounds than themselves. And there's something really interesting, I think, about putting yourself in those shoes. And actors are used to it, and it's something they do all the time. But I think that is one of the most valuable things someone can take away from studying acting, is that perspective and that ability to see what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. So in a way, I wanted to make that accessible to a broader population, to have, give people the opportunity to have that experience, for whatever it's worth to them. I think that permission, in a way, that that license was valuable in terms of giving people different ways to feel comfortable participating. It was understood, by the participants that they were all in character. Of course, it was ambiguous on the outside. But the project in general, I wanted to create different ways for people to participate. So if you're comfortable putting on that persona, you can do that. If you're not comfortable putting on that persona, you can just come watch. If you're kind of in the middle, you can come as a character and interact if you feel like it, but not if you don't want to. So I wanted to give those different inroads, and at the end of the day, I think it really comes down to a shared experience. Everyone has shared this wacky experience together, and there are different levels of truth that have happened, which maybe spark conversations later. I mean, I think a lot of people came to this dinner that I held afterwards, full of questions for each other. Who are you really? What do you really do? And of course we can get philosophical and think, well, now who are we performing ourselves to be as we answer these questions? But everyone came to this dinner feeling like they knew each other really well, even though they might know nothing about each other. But since they had had this shared experience, there was a comfortability with each other, that I think is a little different maybe than if they had initially come together as themselves, and had to kind of perform their own identities. I don't know. I had limited information about who would be playing these roles, so in some cases I could get a sense of their age range based on what they had submitted, but in some cases I had no idea. So some of them I went ahead and said, you have children, you are at this stage in your life or in your career. And some of them I had to keep pretty broad just because I had no idea who that person was going to be. And you know, what would be realistic for them. So that was a really interesting exercise for me in crafting characters. But yeah, you know, I wanted to also give them, just as I wanted multiple ways to participate in the project, I wanted these main characters to have multiple ways they could interact with who they were. So I might give them a particular quality, but then I would give them an out from it if they didn't want to go that route. Like, I think the one who was a banker, you know, I feel like that could be an awfully difficult role to play if you don't really know anything about that world and finance. And if people ask you questions about what you do, it could, you know, without doing lots of advanced research, that could be tricky. So, and that goes for just about any occupation, I guess. But you know, so I said, you know, this is what you do, but you leave work at work and you try not to talk about it when you're outside work. So, you know, that gave that character permission to, if someone asked her a question she didn't know how to answer, she knew she could say, you know, I leave work at work, I don't talk about it. So little things like that I tried to fold in as I was writing them. And of course, overall, I gave people permission to take or leave what they wanted to. I was largely thinking about the individual characters, sort of independent from the group, although I did, I inserted some things with one character that could spark a question with another character, or things that were opposite from character to character, so that there might be things that come up that they could talk about or disagree about or agree about or have in common. Like the character who was a novelist, I had at least one person in her group that had read all of her books. And so, you know, when it came out that that's who she was, that person kind of knew exactly who she was. And so there were little overlaps like that. And there were references speckled all throughout all of the characters to St. Paul and the Twin Cities and the neighborhoods, Frogtown, you know, the places that they were coming from. It opened up a lot of interesting things to think about, and was successful on a lot of levels that were somewhat unexpected to me. Like, some really interesting stories came out of it, and I think the restaurants were happy with how it went. So it's definitely something I would like to revisit, but I have a lot of questions about how and where and how that would look, where I would want to take it. One interesting conversation that came out of the which supper was it? The second supper, I think. There was one participant who is involved with. She works at the U, and she works on getting people from different parts of the food system talking to each other. And in fact, I wonder if she's done a bad interview before. So she was one of the strangers, and she started talking afterwards about how interesting it could be to use this model in getting people from different parts of the food systems talking to each other. So to get a farmer talking to a policymaker, but maybe they play each other, or play, you know, characters similar to each other. What would that be like? What kind of conversation might come out of that? So I'm also now thinking about situations like that this could be a model for. There's a lot of possibility. One role of theater can be to, you know, a lot of people will quote the mirror, you know, we're showing a mirror to society and, you know, reflecting what is happening in the world, and maybe framing it in a way that it can be really seen and digested. That can be one function of theater. I think just coming together for a shared experience is a valuable thing that theater, it very literally does build community in a certain sense, because it brings people into physical spaces together. That's something that is arguably different from a lot of other art forms that don't rely necessarily on that live shared experience. You know, it can certainly raise questions about topical things. It can, you know, stimulate dialogue about topical things. It can also just help us think more expansively. I think I've been veering towards more and more, besides the Stranger Supper series, you know, I'm working with these dancers and veering towards more kind of abstract kinds of writing, and not necessarily character-based or plot-based, not necessarily action-driven, you know, more meditative and contemplative. And there is something valuable to me about creating that space for myself in the process, and also for people who come to experience it. We live in a very saturated world, and it's not so often that we stop and are really present and taking something in and maybe going into the meditative space that it allows us to enter. So that is something I'm interested in creating, and I'm still kind of figuring out, you know, what that means and if it's of value to people. But my sense is that it maybe is. You know, in my last interview with Bat, I talked a little bit about the Eric N. piece, What a Stranger May Know, that I was helping produce a reading of, which is 27 plays happening simultaneously and reflecting on the Virginia Tech shooting. And so that is an example of a piece where you can't possibly take everything in, but you're drifting through it and having an experience and kind of a space to think about some pretty hard things in community with other people who are also thinking about them. So I think that that's something theater offers that I think is kind of rare and valuable.